Hello and welcome to the channel of That 911 Guy. Today we are all about this t-shirt. Well, not the t-shirt itself, but you might see there are 7 cars down here. That represents all 7 generations of the 911. That was until yesterday because Porsche have released the 8th generation of 911 called the 992. Porsche has decided to launch the 992 generation with the Carrera S and the 4S. For the first time, both the Carrera S and the 4S can accelerate from 0 to 62 mph in under 4 seconds. The rear-wheel drive Carrera S can achieve the benchmark in 3.7 seconds, while the all-wheel drive Carrera 4S will do this in 3.6 seconds. Top speed, meanwhile, is 191 mph. The Carrera and the Carrera 4 cars will come along in 2019, and with it, the manual gearbox. That means at the moment with the 992 generation, only Pdk is available. That manual gearbox is going to be the 7-speed carried over from the 991 Gen 2 cars, which is kind of disappointing. I've never truly been enamoured by that myself. Much prefer obviously the 6-speed from the GT cars. With regards to the Pdk gearbox though, it is all changed and Porsche is utilising the 8-speed gearbox from the Panamera. And the reason they've done that is quite simple. It's because the Panamera's gearbox has a gap where they are able to put an electric motor in. Yes, that's right, that does mean that there is a capacity going forward for the 992 generation to be hybrid. For all the enthusiasts out there, don't worry too much, there will not be a hybrid 911 for the Gen 1 generation of 992. Porsche have told us that will come in Gen 2. In terms of specs and dimensions, headline news really is the fact that the narrow body 911 is no more. For 992 generation, every single car will be wide body, sharing the same body as the outgoing 991 Gen 2 generation's GTS. That's 1,852 mm across the rear. The full width rear tail light, as seen on 4-wheel drive 991s, is being moved over to every single car on the 992, whether rear drive or 4-wheel drive. It's a cool design cue. That full width light, or in the earlier days reflector, has always been on a 911 right from 1974 with the G Series car, so there's a real kind of historical significance to that design trait. We can't forget, of course, that above that full width rear light is a significantly wider variable position rear spoiler, along with the much wider arches, just adds to the overall masculinity of this new 992. In terms of other dimensions on the car will sit 5mm higher than the 991 now. It's also 20mm longer as well, and Porsche has said that the reason for that is purely styling. In terms of drag coefficient, the 992 is improved on the 991 Gen 2. It now has a drag coefficient of 0.29. Other things you might notice straight away include the door handles, which now are flush into the body. They pop out when you approach the car and after 10 seconds they pop back in. That's all part of this 911 sort of slow migration into the digital world, which unfortunately, guys, is inevitable. The 911 is also now keyless entry for the first time as well. That greater intervention of technology is very evident inside. As soon as you sit behind the wheel and look forward, the first thing you'll notice is the 911's 5 iconic clocks have gone. In their place we have 2 digital screens either side of what, in fairness, is still an analog tacho, but make no mistake, the 5 famous dials that we've always associated with sitting behind the wheel of the 911 are no more. Staying with the interior and that increase in the use of technology, you'll see the screen in the centre of the dashboard, again, is taken from the Panamera. That's now 11 inches. There's also a raft of new driver technologies which are optional, but they are now there on the 992, including things like lane change assist and night vision. What else can we expect from the 992 generation going forward then? We're also going to have the Cabriolet earlier next year. The Targa will follow. There's no reason for Porsche to not do that. There will be a GT3 and a turbo car later on in the production cycle. To all intents and purposes, the GT3 will remain naturally aspirated. The 911 Turbo, meanwhile, is going to have a reported 650 horsepower in Turbo S form and around 600 horsepower in just turbo form. Okay, now elsewhere with regards to the 992, the wheels. For the first time, a 911 Carrera is going to have staggered wheels, 20-inch at the front, 21-inch at the back. That was a trait, if you remember, that started with the 918, has filtered down with the 991 generation Rennsports in the GT2 RS and the GT3 RS, and has now finally found its way onto the Carrera range. So like I say, 20-inch at the front, 21-inch at the rear. They won't be centre locks though, that will stay for the GTS range and above. The car has the same wheelbase as the 991 Gen 2. The rear track is the same as the GTS, but the front track is wider by 40mm. Porsche basically says that means that it can place a higher load without adding a stiffer anti-roll bar. As you can see, the 992 doesn't look too different from the 991. It was never going to. And in terms of mechanics, it's pretty similar as well under the deck lid. The 9A2 generation flat six that made its debut in the Gen 2 991 has been carried forward into the 992. There have been subtle revisions to the engine here, including a higher compression ratio, that's now 10.5 to 1. There is also a change to intake, ignition and exhaust, and that boosts the car's power in Carrera S form now to around 450 horsepower with 530 Newton meters of torque. It's around about a 30 horsepower increase from the previous generation. Not massive, but very much in sync with what the 911 is all about, and it's kind of constant incremental evolutions. For context, that is the same as a 993 Turbo S. Even the Carrera range now is not slow. Now, I say the 992 looks similar, but there have been some crucial revisions to its body, mainly in the terms of weight. Now, because that 8-speed from the Panamera has had to be carried over, that has also brought with it a 20 kilo weight penalty, and we all know a 911 can't get heavier. So Porsche have looked at the body to save weight, which is 20 kilos lighter. How have they done that? Well, more use of alloy in place of steel, particularly with regards to the roof panel from the beginning of the A pillar all the way back to here, as well as really the front boot and the doors, which are now also alloy rather than steel. That means that the 992 is, according to Porsche, exactly the same weight as the 991 generation. Other news, and this is one for the techies and the mechanics watching this video, for pretty much the first time in the history of the 911, its engine mounting points have changed. What does all this mean? Well, Porsche says that essentially the car is now much stiffer, and you're most likely to feel the benefit of this in the cabriolet cars. Also, can't finish this video about the particulate filter. As we know, as part of EU emissions laws now, all Porsches have to come with this particulate filter in order for it to pass the latest EU 6 emissions tests. US cars will not come with this particulate filter because they don't have the same laws, obviously. Porsche says this won't affect the power figures between US cars and EU cars, so there's no real advantage there. However, the US cars will be 7.5 kilos lighter because they don't have that particulate filter, and we can also expect them to be a little bit more raucous as well in terms of their exhaust note. It's about time the US guys got a little bit of luck in terms of the 911 after being denied pretty much every Rennsport up until the 997 and missing out on 5 years of the turbo and for many years the 959. So you know what, guys, if you're over there, run with it. This is your turn. Much of the 992's interior is fairly similar to the 991. It includes the mode wheel hanging off the main steering wheel. But whereas on the 991 generation you had normal, sport, sport plus and individual, there's now the introduction of a wet mode. What does the wet mode do? Well, you can turn it on when it's raining, but the reality is the system is automatic anyway. What does wet mode do? Well, it primes the chassis in terms of the PSM, primes the gearbox mapping, and it also slightly alters the aero on the car by changing the angle of attack on the rear wing. That basically ensures that the car is better able to cope with the slippery conditions. On the road price for the Carrera S and 4S is up 5 grand over the outgoing 991 Gen 2. That means that the 992 Carrera S can be picked up for £93,000 in the UK, while the Carrera 4S will cost you just over 98 grand. That is pretty much everything on the Porsche 992. I myself am quite excited by the car. I'm really looking forward to driving it and seeing how Porsche has taken this 911 lineage forward. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you in another video.